Hello, my name's Simon Hucker and I'm Senior Specialist in Modern and Contemporary Art here at Lion and Turnbull in London. And today I'm joined by the writer and curator, Monica Bohm, who is the daughter of Dorothy Bohm, one of Britain's most important and most respected photographers. Monica, we first met actually a few years ago working on the Insiders Outsiders Festival. I wondered, as a way of introducing Dorothy, could you tell me a little bit about that festival and what it represents?
With pleasure. Yes, as some people will already know, my mother came as a child refugee from Nazi persecution literally just before the outbreak of the Second World War in June 1939, at the tender age of 14, very mature, unworldly wise, made it to this country. And as an art historian and as my parents' daughter, my father was also from Poland originally, I had the idea a few years ago already to instigate what started out as a nationwide sort of in-person festival, year-long, 2019 it was, 2020, called Insiders Outsiders and subtitled Refugees from Nazi Europe and Their Contribution to British Culture. And it proved a much larger and sort of gratifying project than I ever for a moment imagined, but just sort of sticking to the focus on my mother, of course, the deep down emotional impulse for my initiating that project was indeed a knowledge and sort of a wish somehow to acknowledge my parents' own personal history.
Yeah, no, it was a fantastic project, and there is a book published by London.
Indeed there is, yes.
Recommend reading. I think for somebody like me who works in 20th century British art, the impact on both artists and dealers and writers and publishers was immense, and I think it's a really important part of our history. I think particularly when we think about all the controversy today around immigration, it's an amazingly positive story about how people come to this country and radically transform the culture.
Absolutely, but without forgetting the obstacles and prejudices they had to overcome. I think it's sort of very much, both aspects of it that's important to recall, yes. She was actually born in Königsberg, which at the time was East Prussia, now Kaliningrad rather notoriously in Russia, into an affluent, cultured and Jewish but very assimilated family. Her father was a successful textile factory owner. She grew up without evidencing any particular interest in photography, but when push came to shove, when her parents felt it was necessary to send her to the safety of England, the story goes, and I'm still, it's such an extraordinary story, I'm not absolutely sure if it's true, but she told us many times that just on the point, literally, as she was in the train on that platform about to leave from Lithuania, because the family had moved in 1932 to what appeared then to be the safety of Lithuania, but of course when it came to it the Nazis invaded and it was no longer safe. But in that train, on that platform, her father apparently handed her his beloved Leica. He, unlike her, was actually a keen amateur photographer, and said, "This may be useful to you." I mean, what a story that is. It gives me the goose pimples even to think about it. But anyway, so no, it wasn't there in her consciousness until actually she had left school. She comes in, as I said, June 39, goes to a small school in Sussex in the first instance, matriculates within a year, which is astonishing because, as you mentioned, she had no English at all to begin with, and is looking for something to do. She had wanted to be a doctor, but the finances, she was cut off without any money at all. And in fact, a relation of hers suggested that he'd noticed she was rather observant, and had she thought about photography as a profession? And she said no, but she was introduced to a rather interesting woman I've recently found out more about, called Germaine Canova, who was actually of French origin, who had a portrait studio in Baker Street, not far from where we're talking. And my mum, apparently, she's again acknowledged this many times, said this really opened her eyes to the possibilities of what being a professional photographer might mean. And Germaine Canova said, yes, come and be my apprentice. And then the Blitz started, so it never happened. The studio had to evacuate from London. So my mother instead went to Manchester College of Technology in that northern city, very different from Sussex and certainly very different from where she'd grown up, to study. And she completed a 4-year course in 2 years. Again, there was no money. She felt she had to get on with things. And then she starts working as a portrait photographer, first with somebody else. And at the tender age of 21, she opens her own, 1945, the war has just ended, portrait studio of her own in central Manchester, which actually did remarkably well.
And how long did she have the studio for?
She actually had it for about 10 years, but once she discovered the delights of working outside the studio in the late her 40s, excuse me, she handed over the day-to-day management of it to somebody on the ground there, and she, in the meantime, was spending more and more time abroad. And
is that when she's travelling with your father?
Absolutely.
To go places for his job?
Absolutely. He was a scientist by training, and one of the pioneers in the development of synthetic fibres. And yes, his career was beginning to evolve and flourish in the later 40s. And yes, she would tag along and do her own thing while he was busy with his trips. But the really crucial moment is 1947, when they go to Switzerland. Right. Via Paris, and Paris was to occupy a very special place in her affections, because they were to live there, in fact, for a year in the 50s. But yeah, they discover a beautiful, picturesque, and still today, I've literally just been there this summer, still lovely, lakeside village. It was actually something of an artist colony called Ascona in the Ticino, which is the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland. And she was encouraged by the artists already settled there to start working outside the studio. And that for her was an absolute revelation. In a sense, it was at that point that she started to become the photographer she really, she wanted to be.
Fantastic. And in the sale, we've got a few works that show the different locations in which your mother worked. We've got ones from Lisbon, from Cordoba. Very classic, black and white, technically superb. You can tell that she's got that technical background, but that she's also got this incredible eye for, I suppose, the extraordinary and the everyday.
Absolutely. Starting with a matter of technique. She always said, the camera really wasn't that important. It's the eye that counts. And of course, in large measure, that's true. But it's important, I think, to be aware that the Manchester course was emphatically not an art course. It was very much about the technique, or it's almost the science, technology of photography. So she did with the vintage black and white. She always printed her own prints in her darkroom, which was at our family home. But yes, what an eye. In later years, as she got older and slightly sort of more wobbly on her feet, because she, as many of you will be aware, she lived to a very ripe old age, I would accompany her, and it was quite extraordinary to see how it was purely instinctive, I think, that sort of sense of the right moment to click the shutter. And yes, she travelled broadly, mostly in Europe. So you mentioned Spain, Portugal, New York. They lived in also in the mid-50s. Paris, I already mentioned. Also Israel in the early days of statehood. So yes, really kind of flexing her muscles.
And as well as black and white photographs, we've also got a wonderful group of colour works. And I wonder if you could just say a little about when she moved into colour, because it's, was she a pioneer of colour photography, do you think, in this country?
She was certainly one of the early practitioners of it, I would say. So what happens is that in the early 80s, she's beginning, I think, to feel, as she again said more than once to me, that I'd said all I wanted to say with black and white. She had really mastered, if that's the right word, mastered the medium, and she was looking for new challenges. And as chance would have it, she went to visit André Kertész, the great Hungarian-born photographer, then resident in Manhattan, in his apartment in Washington Square, and he was actually quite elderly and housebound at that point and was working with the Polaroid medium, and she was absolutely beguiled and enchanted by what he was producing and started to experiment with that medium herself. And that was really the kind of the sort of phase which led her from black and white entirely to colour in 1984, when she and my dad first went to the Far East, in fact, and it was then that she started working entirely in colour.
Yeah, it's actually the Polaroids were the first time I really witnessed your mum's work, and I met her at a focus gallery just off Tottenham Court Road, and bought some of her Polaroids. I think they're amazing. I just couldn't believe, actually, that I was meeting such a important photographer, that she was there, approachable in her own private view, and she actually, a couple of them weren't signed, so she signed them for me. I love Polaroids, I love the colour, I love the texture, and I think in your mother's hand she really works that kind of slightly soft feel and the sort of close tonality of Polaroid. I think these little still lives that she would set up and take, they're amazing works.
Yes, no, I completely agree. There's a sort of jewel-like quality, isn't there? Just the sheer size and the format, very, very special. She said many times that actually working with still life, with the Polaroid medium, enabled her to sort of gain some sort of insight into how to work with colour. In the early days, and still lives are controllable. Many of them the subjects were taken in her own lovely home in Hampstead, where she lived to the end of her long life. And in stark contrast to the street photography for which she's best known when it comes to the black and white work.
Yeah, and I love the way she also uses contre-jour. Still lives are often set up in the window, so you're kind of going against good practice photographically, but actually, if in the hands of somebody who's good at it, it has this amazing effect.
Absolutely.
You mentioned André Cortège, and in the auction, as well as Dorothy's own works, we're going to have some of her personal collection of photographers that she knew, that she admired, that she was inspired by. Do you think Cortège was the biggest inspiration for her? Do you think there were other artists that she met, knew and looked towards?
He probably does stand out. I mean, it's worth pointing out that when she was emerging as a photographer, she didn't mix with other photographers at all. Right. She often said that it was painters rather than, and that's where colour again comes in, who were her chief inspiration. Avito Arica, who I think, is also featuring in the auction, was one such early sort of encourager of her work. But what happens is that she becomes one of the main people behind the founding of the Photographers Gallery near Leicester Square in 1971 wasn't it? In the wake of her first solo exhibition at the Institute of Contemporary Arts in 1969. And she and Sue Davies, who was then working at the ICA, worked very closely together to found what became really a sort of hugely important pioneering venture, the first dedicated photography gallery in the country. And it was through that, of course, that she met everyone you could possibly want to meet, both the elder statesmen, if you like, of European and indeed American photography, like Cortège or Manuel Alvarez Bravo, another one, she was personally a friend of, rated extremely highly. Also somewhat younger photographers like Faye Godwin, who she supported and nurtured, Marketa Luskakova. So it was the whole gamut, really, of sort of befriending and indeed helping promote the work of much older, well-established figures, at the time probably not so well known in this country, and then also encouraging rather younger photographers, including some very young ones like Martin Parr, for example.
Actually, Monica's done a great job there mentioning quite a few of the artists who are going to be featured in the sale. It's interesting that you also mentioned paintings as well, because the sale not only features works by Dorothy and works by photographers, but we also have some of her personal collection. And behind us, we have this fantastic early 1930s painting by Ivan Hitchens, one of my favourite artists, somebody I've worked with for many years. And this was hanging in your mum's
top of the stairs, yes.
Top of the stairs, got this amazing bookcase full of just the best selection of novels and art history in all different languages. It was just so impressive, German, French, English, first editions of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. This amazing book had this fantastic early Hitchens painting, which she bought from the art dealer Andras Kalman, who featured in your Insiders Outsiders festival.
Absolutely, and beyond that, they were actually personal friends. Don't quote me on this, but I understand that they'd known each other when they wwere both setting out on their careers in Manchester, I think, originally. Yeah, absolutely, and then stayed in contact when he established his gallery here in Knightsbridge. So yes. Yeah. And it's just one of the many wonderful artworks from a whole range of different geographical areas, cultures, sort of east-west and elsewhere. Very eclectic and absolutely based on just loving the items as artworks, artifacts. There was no sense of ever purchasing things for investment, far from it. It was very much a labour of love, this sort of house. Both my parents, but my mother was the main decision maker, I think, when it came to purchasing items that, that went to make a very special and unusual domestic environment.
And interspersed with those, you'd have photos by your mum as well.
And others.
And it was a really interesting environment. In fact, it's so eclectic that we can't feature all of it in Modern Made sale because it's from all over the world and all from different time periods. So the collection of Dorothy Bohm will be rolled out across a number of sales to include furniture, Asian works of art, Islamic works of art, and these will be coming in the coming months. But we'll start initially with Modern Made, where we'll feature works both by Dorothy herself, by photographers that she knew and admired, and some of the paintings that she had in the house, such as this fantastic Ivan Hitchens.
When's that?
Monica, thank you so much. It's been so interesting to have you here. Thank you for letting us have a brief insight into your mother's life and into her world. There is a book, isn't there, that's just come out celebrating.
Absolutely, yes indeed. We had rather hoped it would mark her 100th birthday, but it was not to be. She died in March 2023, but in June this year, we published a book, or rather Beam Editions in Nottingham, published a wonderful book, although I say it myself, called Dorothy Bohm at 100, A Life in Photography, which is now available. And it is a rather unusual, I mean, she's published many, many books, excuse me, over the years and had many exhibitions, but this book is different because we've taken a thematic approach. We've mixed colour and black and white, and we've invited a whole range of quite eminent contributors from the world of culture to choose particular images and comment on them. So we have, for example, Maria Balshaw from the Tate, Don McCullen, photographer Marina Warner, and a whole array of rather impressive figures who, with alacrity, said yes. So it's come out nicely, and I'm certainly very pleased with it.
Yeah, and I think it's a real testament to how loved your mother was, and how respected she was as both an artist and also as the instigator of the Photographers Gallery.
And a human being.
Thank you very much, Monica.
It's a pleasure.